Whether on the field, on the court, or on the balance beam, there's more to winning than the final score. Hi, I'm Patrick Manning of Black Desert Resort. We recognize the effort it takes to succeed. That's why we are proud to partner with Utah Checkdown, the podcast that tells you the story before the game, then gives you a recap of what happened when it's all over, the grit, the glory, and the disappointments. Join us for stories of Utah's finest athletes and coaches. Thanks for listening.
You're listening to the Utah Checkdown Podcast. And now your host, Josh Furlong.
Welcome back to another edition of the Utah Checkdown Podcast. I am Josh Furlong, happy to be back with you for another week. Man, there's been so much fun on this Utah beat, hasn't there? It's been a fun week of conversations related to the offensive coordinator, transfer portal, all that kind of stuff, and we're going to jump into that again today. So before we get into that, let me tell you about our partners, Black Desert. Black Desert Resort isn't just your home, it's an endless retreat where life is played your way. From intimate studios to spacious 4-bedroom suites, the raw beauty of southern Utah is your new background. Discover its championship golf course, exquisite dining, and world-class outdoor adventures, all yours to conquer. This is luxury your way. Learn more about owning a luxury residence at blackdesertresort.com. Come play, come stay. All right, let's jump right into this. So first off, for all those listening to this on Monday, happy Transfer Portal Day. I don't know if you would celebrate it. Maybe you're still upset about it. I know there's people that get frustrated by this whole transfer portal thing, and I get it. Personally, I think it's actually a great thing for the sport. I don't think it's ruining the sport. I understand there's aspects of it that ruin it in the sense that there's not a lot of loyalty to programs, but I don't fully believe that's the case either. I just think it's an opportunity for players and teams to kind of have more flexibility, right? I've mentioned this before. If you're in a job that you don't feel like you're getting the best opportunities, you should have an opportunity to leave. Also, this is an opportunity for teams to upgrade and do what they need to be able to kind of put themselves in a better position to compete. You're seeing that with teams like Arizona State, who just won the Big 12 championship. They were able to turn over their roster pretty quickly and still honestly aren't even there. I think they're doing it in a way that is remarkable, but their roster is still not kind of where it needs to be for them to compete on a day-to-day basis. Now, I say that knowing that they just ran through the Big 12 and are now in the playoff, but I think if you look at their roster compared to others, it's clearly different. But the fact that they were able to do that in a one-year time span kind of shows what the transfer portal can do. So, yes, you can be frustrated by it, about losing players that you love, but at the same time, that's the nature of this life, right? You've got to be able to give people options, and, it's good. It can be good. And so far for Utah, since the transfer portal has, been around, this has been a good thing for Utah. Utah has traditionally upgraded by that. However, you did see last year a little bit where, over the last few years, I should say, where Utah is, I don't want to say they're going away from kind of their their mantra of or their culture and just everything there. They were trying to go for, stars and different things that way. I think there becomes a look back on that and saying, not saying any of those players were bad necessarily, but I think when you're looking at it, you're trying to find people that fit your culture, right? It's their whole mentality that you become us, not, we don't become you type mentality. And so that's where Utah has to maintain. If they want to go in the transfer portal, that's great. Everybody's going into the transfer portal outside of Dabble Swinney and, the academies, maybe Stanford, those types of programs. But you've got to be able to live in the transfer portal, but you've got to do it with your culture in mind. And you can upgrade by getting better players and getting people that are there. I mean, you look at somebody like a Dorian Singer, 100% a Utah culture guy. He was also one of the best receivers in the class. right? And so it was a perfect fit for them. Unfortunately for Singer, obviously the QB situation didn't work out very well, and he wasn't able to have the breakout season that he was probably projecting. But at the same time, this was what Utah should be going after. Once again, I'm not trying to say that Utah went after guys that weren't of that, but I think there's sometimes some slippage there, and it's easy to kind of chase stars and try to get talent instead of guys that are cultured. And if you can blend the two, even better. So that's kind of where it's at. We're going to jump into the transfer portal in a second. But the biggest news of the weekend came when Kyle Whittingham announced late that he is returning for another year as the head coach of Utah. And based on the reactions that I've seen on Twitter or Blue Sky or other message boards or other things, the feelings are split. And I understand it, right? Like I completely understand the emotions of that, where when you say that Kyle Whittingham's back, that can cause some frustrations. The frustrations mostly being that there's been some things where he kind of this last year he changed and kind of made things difficult for everybody in terms of not talking about injuries, which absolutely put Cam Rising in a bad position. It put players in a bad position because they didn't know what was going on. It was the general message that was sent out to the world, essentially, that this is where Utah's at and nobody had a clue what was going on. And so it became a really difficult situation. There was also things where the decision makings and the things that were being done weren't really fitting what Kyle Whittingham has traditionally done. And so he had to go back to his the roots, I guess you can call it, and try to get back to where they are. Now, Kyle, in a lot of the press conferences leading up to the end of the season, talked about, how they had to have a much improved offense. They had to have a plug-and-play offense. They had to have different things that allowed them to compete in the new era of college football. What worked for Utah in the past, where you had guys sit there in the offense, not in the offense in general, but just in on the team, mature, go through it for a couple years and stay in there, it doesn't work now necessarily. That's not to say that guys can't be in there. You can't get a guy from a freshman and bring them up through their senior year. That still happens. It's just more rare, right? And so you can't necessarily have an offense or a defense that is so complicated that it takes these guys ages to be able to learn it. And so part of that is, he's got to learn and adapt. And that's tough, right? And I think that's where most of that frustration comes with Kyle, is when he's coming back, it takes a lot to be able to adjust and adapt 20 years into your career as the head coach. And clearly there was something needed to be done on the offensive side of the ball. And so, if it's going to be the same, it doesn't really matter who you hired, right? If you're going to be the same and you're still going to be conservative, you're not going to, you're so risk averse that you don't want too many passes in the middle, or you don't want things in different situations, and you kind of handicap your offense, it's really going to be the same thing. Now, part of that is with Kyle, there's a lot of trust there, right? He absolutely trusted Andy Ludwig. He absolutely trusted Cam Rising. And the pairing of those two together is why Utah was so successful. Tyler Huntley was another guy there, right? It took a while, right? It took Tyler a little bit. He was turnover prone early on. He had some happy feet. He really eventually started to settle in and became a wonderful quarterback for Utah. And it worked out well, but it took some trust and maturation in that process to be able to get there. And by the time he had Andy Ludwig his last year, Utah was able to do things that, honestly, they hadn't been able to do for a lot of Kyle Whittingham's tenure. Then you get Cam Rising, and suddenly everything changes, right? This is kind of where Kyle has been forever. If he trusts you and he feels like, you have a good handle of the offense, or you have whatever, then he's going to be much more relaxed in his conservatism in terms of play calling, being able to do things that haven't traditionally been done. But when things go wrong, as we saw this year, that kind of reverts there, where you start becoming a lot more conservative, and you want to be able to do things that limit stuff. Obviously, you put more of an emphasis into the run game. This year, the run game outside of Mekhi Bernard wasn't there. And so it just became just kind of this general, terrible offense, essentially. And so I think that is marring people's opinions on Kyle Whittingham coming back. I know I've gone kind of a roundabout way of getting there, but I think a lot of that is the background that gives this context of why people are frustrated with Kyle Whittingham. But with that said, you have a guy that has built this program into what it is today, right? I don't think there's anybody, this isn't arguable or anything, I think. Kyle Whittingham has done more for this university than probably any other coach before that. Yes, there's other incremental steps and other people that have built it, right? Like, it's not just Kyle Whittingham, and Kyle's the last person to even put that credit on himself. It's going to be about the players. It's going to be about the coaches that he's been with. But at the end of the day, it's his structure. And so if you can maintain that, if you can maintain that culture, and if you can maintain kind of his cachet in the college football world, that helps, right? And that's huge with boosters. Boosters want to be able to have that. They want the guy that's going to be able to go to the table with them and be able to help, right? That's not a knock on Morgan Scalley, who is the heir apparent. But at the same time, if you've got that guy and he's still able to have the energy and the passion to do it, and, outside of this last year, there really hasn't been much of a mistake, then you're fine, right? Now, that's not to say that there can't be errors along the way, and there can't be things that as he gets older and as he continues to go through this, that there could be some issues, right? I think sometimes people hold on too long. I'm not saying that Kyle is there. I honestly think that he's good. I just think that the signs were pointing to him leaving based on kind of how this season went, kind of the frustrations. It was wearing on him. You could kind of see that in his face. But I don't think that he's ever lost that, right? This is a guy that lives, breathes, eats everything football. And if anything, it's not even just the football. It's being able to see these guys come into the program, help them mature, help them as individuals. That's what he loves, right? The football, absolutely, that's his thing. But he really does love to see these guys grow and be able to graduate. Like, he truly believes in a lot of that stuff, and it fits what the University of Utah wants in him and any head coach. Now, with that said, going into year 21, I can't imagine that this is much longer. I think he wants to go out on a much better, in a much better position. Obviously, that's not really hard to guess, right? Nobody wants to leave on a 5-7 season after a 20-year career where have had back-to-back Rose Bowl appearances, back-to-back Pac-12 championships. You also look at kind of the nature of the Big 12, and you feel like you can still get in there, right? You can get into the Big 12 championship. You can go in there, and like I've said, if Utah had just a moderate offense, a moderate passing offense, Utah is going to be fine. And they're at least in contention for that championship game. And at least maybe it changes some of the tones of the game and allows them to be able to be in a situation that they weren't, right? And so you're getting a head coach that, if everything can go well this next year, I think that becomes a great opportunity for him, right? Now, with that said, going into the 2025 season, there's far more questions about this team than there were this last year. And, maybe there should have been more questions about this team, but I think given the roster, given everything that they'd done, there was no reason to really question a lot of that stuff. And you can argue, the media should be able to go see practices so that we could give you as the public more feedback. And I 100% agree with that. And I think that absolutely does you more of a service as a fan, the supporters of this program, to be able to understand what's going on. But that's just the nature of what this is going to be, right? Kyle Whittingham isn't necessarily going to open up practices suddenly. It's not going to change just because he's coming back for another year. With that said, the future has to look towards Morgan Scalley. From everything that I've heard, Morgan was involved in the process of hiring Jason Beck, the new offensive coordinator. He's going to be involved in a lot of the day-to-day decisions with that. What that looks like, I'm still curious to hear, right? We haven't had a chance to talk to Kyle or Morgan or any of these guys since the season has ended. Usually we get a post-recruiting press conference. We didn't get that because they were in the middle of hiring for a offensive coordinator. So they were preoccupied with doing all that stuff. Understandable. I hope that we get something in the coming days that allows us to be able to talk to them. I always try to get a conversation with Kyle in the offseason after a few weeks just to kind of see where they're at. But we don't know what that structure is going to look like. Everything in the conversations that they were leading up to the end of the season, we're talking about, because Morgan is the heir apparent, because he's the head coach in waiting, a lot of those decisions have to, I don't want to even call it a 50-50 split, but they have to be with Morgan in mind, right? It's not like with Kyle coming back, it's not like they had to do all of this because he can just say, look, this is my roster still, this is my team, I'm going to do it. But Kyle absolutely wants to set up Morgan for success. And so if he can do that in a way where this is kind of a gap year, so to speak, not even a gap year, a bridge year, we'll call it. This is where he can kind of bridge the two coaching staffs. That becomes a great opportunity. And I know some people have said that's been happening for a long time. It's holding on too long. Morgan Scalley is going to be frustrated, and how long can Kyle stay on? That's all totally acceptable, right? If you've been in a position where you're just waiting for somebody else to move on, that becomes a challenge, right? At the end of the day, Morgan is, a Utah man and he wants to be here, but there comes a point where if Kyle holds on for so long, you wouldn't be surprised if Morgan decided to start looking somewhere else. I'm not saying that's imminent. I'm not even saying that's a possibility right now. But at the same time, that's kind of that situation, right? And so there's going to be some things where Kyle is going to have Morgan more involved in things. Maybe it's saying, look, yes, you're the defensive coordinator, but I'm going to let you kind of oversee some of the offensive, decision-making. That's obviously Jason Beck and how he does things with the offense, but in terms of maybe how the head coach approaches that, maybe Morgan gets involved in that, right? I don't know. I doubt that, but at the same time, maybe there's different things there that allow him to be able to have more of a stake in the future of this. Jason Beck and Morgan Scalley, they had conversations as part of this. They know each other well. This was something that Morgan wanted as well. It's embracing kind of the structure and the style that Morgan wants to implement as an offense. And so I think there's a lot of blending here, but I still, this is still Kyle's show. And so what that decision looks like and how that all goes, those are the questions that I'm going to have, especially as we go into spring and kind of what's going on there. But at the end of the day, you still have your head coach. He's one of the greatest head coaches in college football right now, what he's been able to do. Have there been missteps? 100%. And he would be the first to admit it, right? He's one that's going to take all the blame for everything, and he believes that, that it should fall on him. And, some of that's not fully him, but at the same time, yeah, it is, because you're the head coach, you're responsible for everything. And, that's kind of where Utah's at. And so we'll see how this looks moving forward. I'm really fascinated by kind of how this dynamic will be. I don't imagine it changing too much, to be honest, especially to the public. I think this is going to be something that it's pretty much the same. So, curious to see what it is. Maybe this is Kyle's last year. We would never know because he's not that type to kind of make it about him. It's always about the team. It's about other people. So once again, I think, if Kyle decides to retire, it's going to be sometime at the end of the year next year where he just rides out into the sunset, says his time is done, and moves on. So that's that. Let's jump into the transfer portal. That's the biggest news outside of that. Obviously, Kyle coming back is big news, but the attention now turns to the 2025 season, right? It's weird, kind of watching these championship games and watching these bowl games and not seeing Utah involved at all. Usually I'm kind of in the thick of it with bowl prep. It has been championship prep a few of these years. It's been a lot of that. And so to not have that has been a different, kind of structure for me, even trying to follow this. And so it's different that Utah is now fully immersed in the 2025 season starting in December. Technically, the team won't meet again until January, but the coaching staff, especially with the transfer portal churning, this is kind of all it right now. So 2025 is on us. It's wild to think that that's the case, but if Utah can get a good jump on it, that's a great opportunity for them. A lot of these other schools are now focusing on bowl games or, playoff games or something like that. Utah's now solely focused on just the transfer portal and building their roster and kind of helping that way. So to kind of start this conversation, as I mentioned, the transfer portal opened officially today. Players have already announced that they were entering into the portal, last week. They can't officially go in until today. Now's the day where you can also pick up players. So soon we'll start seeing some commits come to Utah. We'll talk about maybe at least some that are coming or at least expected to come. And then, this transfer portal goes through December 28th. And what that means is you just have to be in the transfer portal or at least have your intentions out there by December 28th. And then, you can still remain in the portal. People can pick you up. That doesn't stop. That aspect is there. Teams can pick up players, well into whatever date they want to do it. It's just a matter of kind of when you have your roster and kind of where you feel set. There's also the spring one, that kind of opens it up again, but we won't get into that. That kind of takes on its own life in a little bit of ways, but for the most part, this is the big one where a lot of the players come and put their names in the portal after the seasons have ended, and so that's kind of where you're at. So right now, Utah is currently at 15 players and counting. There's going to be more, right? I expect probably 3 to 5 more. Who knows? It's hard to fully tell. But as part of this, the biggest aspect of this transfer portal season, I know a lot of people will look at this and be like, wow, that's a lot of players, and it is, but Utah's going on a full reset on offense. This is not something where they're going to just kind of lightly dip their toes in the water. No, this is a full embracing of reset on offense. That button has been pushed. They have completely, whether it's the player's choice or the coaching choice and saying kind of their priorities for these players, it's been a full reset. And so as a result of that, you've lost a ton of offensive players. Just since we last talked, I listed off a few names last week, but since we last talked, Damian Alford, wide receiver, Samote Pepa, defensive lineman, Jack Baumeister, punter, John Randall Jr., who was a running back who transitioned to corner in fall camp. He's in the portal. You have all 3 quarterbacks, Brandon Rose, Isaac Wilson, Sam Heward, they're in the portal, and you also have tight end C.J. Jacobson. So you've lost a lot of your depth, especially at quarterback and at running back. You've lost essentially all of your running backs outside of Mike Mitchell. You've lost all of your quarterbacks except for Cam Rising, who is still on the fence. As of the latest, right before I went on here, 24/7 Sports announced that Cam Rising is not coming back, according to sources. Those are the same things that I'm hearing as well. It was always a situation that was going to be tough for Cam to come back. Whether he decides to even play football collegiately anymore, try to pursue the NFL, those conversations he's still having. I don't know what that looks like for him. At the end of the day, Utah is moving on. And I think that's a good thing. That, it sounds calloused in some respects, but I think with where Cam is at, you can't have him continually handicapping your season, right? That's not a knock on him because he's obviously been a phenomenal player for Utah. And I think Utah, owes him a ton of respect to be able to get where they are today. Utah is the program that they are today largely because of what Cam Rising was able to do. You got into 2 Rose Bowls. Obviously, you had a chance against Ohio State. Penn State wasn't even a chance. But you get 2 Pac-12 championships. You put Utah on the map where it bumped Utah up to another level, especially in the recruiting front, where teams or players started to take Utah a little bit more seriously. Obviously, Utah's been a contender, since they've joined the Pac-12. It took them a few years to get there, but it's taken a while. And Cam really kind of solidified what that meant. But based on his injuries and kind of where he's at, Utah can't rely on him as a starting quarterback. Now, look, if you wanted to bring him on as a depth player and help him coach up guys, that's great. But the reality is I don't think Cam wants that, right? If Cam is going to come back, he wants to play. He wants to start. But I don't think, I think trying to make that work for Utah would be a disjustice to the rest of the players. And that's just the nature of it, right? You've got to eventually cut ties and move on. And I think you can still have that belief while still absolutely respecting him for one of the best players to come through Utah and allowing, his talent to be able to really raise Utah to where it is. But at the same time, you have to move forward. And that's where Utah's at. So when I say they've hit the reset button, they've essentially gone all in on that, right? The biggest flaw on offense was the quarterbacks. Obviously, Cam got hurt. There wasn't a flaw there necessarily, but his injury prone, maybe that's the flaw, right? And then you had, inconsistent play from the rest of the quarterbacks. Then they got injured. There's other, factors that went into that. But at the end of the day, the quarterbacks couldn't move the ball. There were skill players that could do things, right? Like, obviously, there was players that could catch the passes. That was great. Obviously, the run game needed to be reset as well. They weren't able to get what they needed to outside of Mekhi Bernard. But you're not getting Mekhi Bernard back anyway because he's a senior and he's moving on. And so a mixture of the transfer portal and the senior class leaving, this essentially leaves, empty cupboards, which is in some respects great for Utah because now they can completely invest in the full reset. They can have Jason Beck come in here and he can have a blank slate to be able to work with. That's a great thing. I know it's frustrating to lose players, and I'm not saying any of those players weren't contributors or players that could have been, great key pieces for this offense moving forward. Yeah, there could be, right? But I think with where Utah's at, it wasn't fair to them, and it's not fair to, the team moving forward to have kind of some of that stuff lingering. This becomes an opportunity for them to be able to move forward. Reality is there were only 19 teams worse than Utah in total offense in the FBS. That's not great. Utah was 129th out of 134 in passing. And they had a grade of a 49.7 from Pro Football Focus, which is not fully, without, problems. But at the same time, it's a good measure of kind of where Utah was at. I mean, Utah, the only teams worse than Utah in terms of grades were Central Michigan, Kent State, Charlotte, New Mexico State, and Kennesaw State. I don't expect you to know a ton about those programs, but I'm going to guess you realize that, them being at the bottom and Utah being right there with them is probably not where you want to be, especially for a team that was picked to win the Big 12 this year. You can't be there. And, if you had just a moderate offense or a moderate passing offense, we'll say, you're going to be fine. If you could have put up 25 points per game, which is not really that far of a stretch. I mean, that's a team ranked 90th in the country in terms of scoring. You win at least 9 games and maybe more. We've talked about this. I get it. But Utah had to go a full reset. So you can say, oh, Brandon Rose, you wanted him. You saw a lot of progress in what he was able to do with BYU. And I personally, and I've said this on Twitter, I personally believe that Brandon Rose would have fit the model that John Beck wants to utilize, right? Or Jason, this is going to be the confusing thing. It's not John Beck. They're totally different people. This is Jason Beck. My apologies. But Jason Beck, could utilize Brandon in a way that would absolutely work. He fits the mold of the type of quarterback in terms of his ability to kind of be a more physical, bigger-bodied quarterback that can run but also can, pass and work in that RPO-type system. Isaac Wilson, he could absolutely work with him as well. But I think with where Isaac was at in this situation, where he took the heat for everything, obviously did not have a great season. He took the heat for everything that took place for that offense. It really wasn't going to be fair for him or give him a great chance to try to succeed moving forward. For whatever reason, it wouldn't be a great situation. I'm not saying that he couldn't have had success here if he stayed, but I think that becomes a very difficult challenge for a player to try to kind of resurrect your career after you were so highly touted coming in and then you just kind of get crushed. It's the same thing you see in the NFL, right? His brother obviously is experiencing that in the NFL. Came in as highly touted quarterback, went to an organization that is just is terrible, right? I'm sorry to Josh Newman, but the Jets are just a terrible organization. They haven't figured it out. They don't know what they're doing. And, a combination of not being able to help Zach Wilson out and a combination of him not being able to perform just led to this general consensus that he was not a great quarterback. We don't really know what his potential in the NFL is because, it was kind of ruined in New York. Now he's with Denver as a backup, and it's working great for him in that respect where he can kind of learn and grow and mature. We'll see if he ever gets an opportunity to be a starter again, but that's where it's at. This is a similar situation with Isaac. You were kind of given the keys earlier than you were expected, and there were some decisions made that didn't really help, and then at the same time, you didn't perform the same way that you needed to live up to those expectations, but at the same time, you're a true freshman. It's a really tough situation, right? And so to be able to put all those on him is really tough. And so, I think for him, it's just best probably to have that opportunity where he can go somewhere else, get a reset, get a restart, do whatever he needs to. Sam Heward, obviously he was buried in the roster. You can't fault him for wanting to go elsewhere. Kind of similar to that same thing with Brandon Rose. He was buried on the roster forever, and then he does get a chance and gets injured. He's in an equally tough spot because now he's facing an injury rehab while trying to go through the transfer portal. There's no future plans at Utah for him, and so it's kind of a tough situation for him. I think he's got potential, and I think he can do it. It's just going to be a really, it's an uphill battle essentially for him as he tries to get over where he was at with Utah. So I'm curious to see what that is, but I think you can understand why these decisions were made, right? You can say, it sucks to lose Isaac Wilson. He was expected to be the future of Utah football. But you can also recognize the points along the way that allowed him to not be able to be that guy, and how it would be so much harder for him to be able to try to be there. At the same time, you can project looking into the future. Every single team in the country, if they don't have something that is working, they're going to try to upgrade it. It's the same in, college. It's the same in the NFL. That's just the nature of this business. If you can't succeed in one area, or you don't feel like you are great, you're going to try to increase. Ohio State dropped their quarterback, who was actually pretty decent, in Kyle McCord, to try to get an upgrade. You can argue whether that worked out or not. I'm not gonna decide that. Kyle McCord's done well at Syracuse, but at the same time, teams are always trying to upgrade, and maybe some of that is the personalities in the locker room, whatever that may be. But teams are always going to upgrade, and so you look at that, and you look at the offense that Utah had. They were always going to go to the transfer portal. They were always going to try to find a quarterback that could be even better. They've been trying to do that for the last few years, at least trying to get a depth QB to be able to back up Cam Rising, but it's really tough to try to convince a quarterback with starter caliber minutes or, opportunities available to them behind a guy that was, always going to be the starter. And yeah, you could point to his injury history and say, okay, you'll probably be the guy eventually, but it's tough. It's a tough sell. Guys want to move on, and they want to be able to come to a place where they feel like they can start. Now Utah's at a point where they can have those conversations with people. They can look at the market and say, you know what? We've got an empty slate, and you could fit our model as a starting quarterback. The competition is you right now. And so it's kind of fascinating to kind of see how that'll work. But I think that's a great position for Utah to be. Now, at the same time, there's going to be other teams around the country that are fighting for these same players, right? Utah obviously wants the best quarterback that they can possibly get. And so there has to be some realism on who they can get and who they should maybe be fighting for, right? At the same time, it sounds like Utah already has their quarterback in mind. And it makes sense. I've talked about it last week. It's Devin Dampier. He's the quarterback from New Mexico. And I know some people just hear the name New Mexico and they're like, great, now we're getting a terrible quarterback. We got to stop that. There's a lot of these players that perform at lower levels or, schools that you feel like don't jive with where Utah's at. The reality is Utah's not there, right? Utah is not the same as an Ohio State. They're not the same as Oregon. Yes, you used to go toe-to-toe with Oregon. But at the same time, that's not where you're at. And so you have to be realistic with who you are, where you're at, and what is available to you. And so they've got to be able to come to this. And at the same time, you're bringing in a guy, if it is Devin Dampier, and I've heard a lot that it is him, conversations that I've had, that he's going to come in, this is a great thing for Utah. Honestly, it probably is one of the best things for Utah. You get a guy that is proven to be able to be successful, obviously led the number 4 offense in the country this year. And yes, you can argue, it was done in the Mountain West. I don't care. Boise State did it in the Mountain West, and they're still one of the best teams in the country, right? And is the Mountain West this year that much different from the Big 12? I don't want to hear the conversations because it's not. Yes, the Big 12 is better by and large. Yes, whatever. But at the same time, those top-end teams like a Boise State, I guarantee you would probably be able to win a lot of games in the Big 12 this year. So it's not like this is some massive drop-off. Now, I get it. New Mexico is not a name that anybody's talking about for football, right? I get it. But at the same time, he led the number 4 offense and was able to do phenomenal in a sophomore season. Does that mean that he is this great quarterback out there and is suddenly going to do everything the same way at Utah? No. Utah hopes that he can do that, if not exceed that. Especially if you can get more talent, in the room, where Utah going into the bidding room with New Mexico is going to be far different, right? Utah's going to have much more of an advantage in the transfer portal than New Mexico. That's for sure. But at the same time, you're going to just acquire talent that's going to be great. And the best asset of this is that he already knows Jason Beck. He works well with him. He understands his system. Jason has already schemed something towards Dampier, who, as we've talked about before, Beck absolutely wants to scheme around his players. He understands him inside and out, and he can continue to work with that. What better opportunity do you have than that? You get an opportunity to be able to come in there and be able to have a quarterback that understands the OC, has a connection with him, and they've already done phenomenal things. Now, if you can just get him to jive with, the other skills players and the other players, everything's going to be right. Now, once again, that doesn't mean that Utah is suddenly going to just have this potent offense and everything's going to be great, right? As we've seen, you also have to have depth. You also have to have other players that go around them that are going to work. You have to have a locker room that has a great chemistry. All of those things can change so quickly. And so if Dampier comes in and this is the guy that they're focusing in on, and he doesn't fit any of those things, yes, this could be a disaster, right? But that's the nature with any transfer. At the same time, Utah has to continue to find those guys that they feel like fits that model. And it sounds like this could be the case, where he fits the model that Utah wants. He fits the model that Beck wants. And so it's a huge win-win opportunity, right? Now, let's just assume this. Let's assume that Dampier is the guy, right? You're still going to have to go get some quarterbacks, and there's other guys that are in the portal that are interested in Utah. I've had people reach out to me talking about how, they're interested in Utah. So there is conversations there. Some of those guys are going to be your depth pieces, right? But Dampier comes in, and this is who you expect to be able to be your starter. He was a sophomore this year, so you've essentially got him for 2 more years. And if you can get him to perform at the level, if not that level and more, that's a great opportunity for Utah. That's a huge opportunity, honestly. Like, it's a great situation if they can be able to do this. So I wanted to compare some of this stuff. So looking at him, he rushed for, 1,166 yards. That's with sacks taken in. College does that, where they minus that out. Pro Football Focus looks at it, and it's not much different, honestly. Without sacks, it's 1,184 yards, and so it's not a ton different. But that would make him the 3rd highest rusher of quarterbacks in the country this year. The 2 that were ahead of him, Bryson Daly at Army, that's kind of a no-brainer, and then Tyler Huff at Jacksonville State, whatever. He's in the top end mix of that, right? He rushed for that, had 19 rushing touchdowns, as we talked about last week, 7.52 yards on an average. He also threw for 27, 68, had 12 passing touchdowns, and yes, there's 12 interceptions in there, and his completion percentage was 57.9%. I get that. Those things, those can be the big negative that everybody looks at, especially in a Kyle Whittingham offense where, being risk averse and not wanting to get interceptions, that has to come down. But at the same time, he's a sophomore. So you have to imagine that any quarterback that is able to sit in here and work in Beck's system, in theory, should be able to cut that down, right? It's the same things that we talked about with Isaac Wilson as a freshman. Once you start getting more acclimated to the system, things can change and you can be a better player. That doesn't mean it's a guarantee, but things can change. And if he can cut down those even by half, that's a great opportunity for Utah, assuming, once again, that he's the guy. But looking at this in totality, I was really curious about this because there's not every team out there wants to find that dual threat quarterback, that true dual threat quarterback that can do everything where you just really make it difficult on opposing defenses. Utah's obviously had those moments where it makes it really difficult. That's where this changes the game for Utah. Obviously, Kyle loves the run-first mentality. And if you can also add that with a running quarterback who has done it for years in the same scheme that Beck has allowed him to do it, it becomes great. But, in totality, he, throwing and passing, he was at 3,952 total yards. So I wanted to compare that with some of the quarterbacks that have been similar to that, right? Not all quarterbacks rush the same. Some of them, maybe rush for 500 yards in a season. There's very few each season that actually rush for over 1,000 yards each season. And the ones that do, quite honestly, especially the ones at a big-time school, are generally, I say this generally, and I don't want to get this twisted, are generally in kind of a Heisman kind of candidate realm. Looking at the last, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 years, 3 of those have been Heisman winners. Obviously, you have Jaden Daniels, you have Kyler Murray, and Lamar Jackson. Now, look, I'm not projecting any of that kind of stuff, right? Obviously, if you can get the potential out of that, and if you can get anywhere near that, regardless of if a player is in the Heisman contention or not, is kind of, it doesn't matter. If you can get him close to that, it's a great situation, right? But looking at this, I was curious. Like I said, Jaden Daniels, his last year when he wins the Heisman, he rushes for 1,200 yards, 1,250, throws for 3,800 yards, so 5,000. Total yards. So that's 1,000 more total yards than what Dampier's at. That's his veteran year, right? That's the year that he gets it. He had 50 total touchdowns, 40 passing touchdowns, 10 rushing touchdowns. It's a lot. And so you can see that level for Jaden Daniels, right? The year before, though, if you look at it, the year before when he was in LSU, so he really kind of started to get in there. He's also maturing in there. He threw for 39.92, which is exactly the same number. Not exactly, but you get it. It's like 40 yards away from what Dampier was at. He had 17 touchdowns passing, 11 touchdowns rushing, so for 28 total touchdowns. What Dampier had, 19 rushing touchdowns, 12 total passing touchdowns. Pretty similar. Exactly. I mean, it's actually more. So there is hope looking at that if you can continue to progress. Jaden Daniels, obviously, in his junior year, did well. Same numbers as what Dampier had. The next year, he exploded and was able to have a Heisman winning season. Once again, I feel like I have to always say this. That doesn't say that Dampier is going to do that at Utah, right? But you want to be on that same trajectory. You want to be able to be there. If you have a guy that is in that type of a conversation, that can do a ton of damage to teams. It allows you to be able to be effective. This was the same case for Malik Willis at Liberty. Obviously, he was getting a ton of praise. Wasn't necessarily in the Heisman conversation all the time. But, I mean, he's throwing for 4,000 or combining for 4,000 yards one year, 3,200 yards another year. Similar numbers, right? Obviously, is in the NFL, projected to do well. We'll see how that all turns out, whatever. Jalen Hurts, he's at Oklahoma, 5,200 total yards, 1,400 rushing, 3,800 passing, 52 total touchdowns. I mean, these guys have taken it to the next level, right? And that is what separates a lot of these guys, especially those Heisman type players. Jalen Hurts is in that conversation. Kyler Murray, similar, 54 total touchdowns. Lamar Jackson, 45 total touchdowns. He had 51 the year that he won the Heisman. I mean, these are guys that are combining for over 5,000 yards. Passing and rushing, there's a next level there. But if Utah can continue to build off of that and be able to get a guy that is in that realm, that absolutely helps, right? And so I think that's what Utah's looking at. You can look at the flaws. You can say, okay, there's 12 interceptions, and his passing percentage at under 60% is not ideal. It's not. I mean, that's the reality of it. But if you can get some of that, and if you can get some depth, and if you can get some more skills players around that where you can go and kind of attack, this becomes a great win for Utah. I know there's a lot of people that wanted John Mateer from Washington State. I get that. But actually, Devin Dampier in a lot of metrics has actually been better. Not all, but better in some. And so you're getting a quarterback, if he does commit to Utah, that is going to be effective. At least shows that he can be effective. That's not to say that it'll work, a one-to-one translation at Utah. Obviously, things are different. Utah's in a different league. The Big 12 is still better. My previous comment wasn't to say that the Big 12 wasn't better, but I'm saying it's not that far off that, it's going to be this huge change. It will be a change. And there's things that he's got to learn, and there's things that he's got to, progress on. But if you bring Beck in, and you also have the QB offensive analyst and Coy Detmer Jr. coming along too, he's at Utah now, you've got a lot of consistency there. And so if you've got your quarterback who understands the system already, that becomes a major thing. And so we'll see what that looks like if that's the case. Everything is trending that way. Obviously, it's not been set as of the, doing this podcast, and Utah hasn't committed to anybody or hasn't gotten a commit from anybody, and so we'll see what happens there. But everything is trending that way from what I've heard. That would be a great opportunity for them. So what is Utah going to look for in the transfer portal? I mean, at the end of the day, they're going to try to find the best talent available that wants to come to Utah. That fits their culture. They have to get into that. But the priority is obviously going to be QB. I think Kyle says that all the time. It has to be that, right? it's got to be the quarterback, and especially this year where that depth has been decimated. You've got to find the QB that works, and if that's Dampier, that's great. Now you've got to find some depth. And there's going to be some guys that can come in and then be the depth players. There's guys that want opportunities and they can see what's going to happen. But it's not going to be easy once you get that starter. You're going to have to find guys that are maybe, looking as Utah as a retread, something, whatever they can do to try to find an opportunity. But that aspect becomes much more difficult. You do have 2 true freshmen coming in next year. I don't know that you want to rely on that based on how things went this last time. And I also don't think that they're kind of at that same level of what Isaac was expected to be. And so you do have to get more, quarterbacks out of the transfer portal. So that's priority number 1. Outside of that, you absolutely have to, work in the run game room, right? And so you're going to try to get some running backs. You're trying to get guys there. Yes, Mike Mitchell is still on the roster. I haven't heard, one way or the other whether he wants to leave. I don't think he does, but, in this age, things change all the time, and so it's hard to fully know. But you've got to rebuild that. Yes, you have, once again, more freshmen coming in, but it's a tall task to be able to have them just jump right in. I am curious to see, though, some of these guys in Beck's system, if they can kind of fit into this model faster as freshmen. I still think it's a tall task to be able to want to put that all on them. But if you can get somebody like a Racine Gilroy, a 4-star guy who obviously is projected to be a little bit better than the others, if you can get him to come right in and he does the things that they need him to do, maybe he sees the field, that becomes a great opportunity for Utah. I think at running back, that's probably a better opportunity where you can probably see the field earlier. So I don't think the depth is completely as bad, but it is still not great, right? Next to quarterback, running back is the next priority. Outside of that, they're going to try to find, more wide receivers. They got to get more skills players. That includes tight ends. But at the same time, Beck, it's not that he doesn't include tight ends, but it's not as big of a priority as what Andy Ludwig did, right? There's still an opportunity there. As of right now, Landon King is still on the roster. Dallin Bentley's still on the roster. I think I'm blanking somebody else, but you've got some guys there. But if you lose, Carson Ryan, yes. If you lose any of them to the transfer portal, obviously that becomes a big priority. You're still going to want to get there, but I think you're not going to see the levels that Utah was at this year where they had 6 tight end. That clearly didn't work out as well. They weren't able to get them on the field. Part of that, a lot of that was honestly the passing game struggles, but we'll see how that goes. You're obviously going to look into your secondary. You're going to get corners and safeties. They're not as bad there, but you're still going to need some proven guys there trying to get them in and get them in spring to be able to really get into that system. Linebackers, you're always going to want more depth there. But for the most part, offense is going to be where Utah focuses. Quarterback, running back, and then on the outside, right? Wide receivers, tight ends, whatever that may be. There are some options, whether that be from New Mexico. You can't take everything from New Mexico, but if it works, that works. Eli Sanders is a running back from New Mexico. Luke Weissong, wide receiver, did really well at New Mexico. Curious to see if there's attention there given to them. Obviously, Sanders probably has a greater opportunity to have an impact there than Luke Weissong from New Mexico. But I think Utah, is going to try to get the best of players possible, right? That's not a no-brainer. But they're going to be active in this portal. They're going to work really hard to try to be able to get the best players that they can that fits their culture. So the next few days especially are going to be pretty wild. And by the time you listen to this podcast, maybe some players will have already committed or, left Utah. I think it's probably going to slow down a bit for the players leaving Utah. There's just not a ton left anymore. But that's not to say that there won't be some players that go. We may get some conversations about guys going into the NFL draft. You're looking at somebody like a Lander Barton. If Lander decides to leave to go to the NFL draft, obviously that ups the attention on linebacker. Keanu Tanavasa has, as I've talked about, has been weighing whether he wants to go to the NFL. That's still kind of TBD based on the grades and everything there. But if he leaves, D-line maybe becomes a little bit more of a priority than it has in past years. But For the most part, as I mentioned, the offensive side of the ball is going to be where it's at, and Utah's going to focus in on that. So we'll see how this goes. I don't know if we'll do much more of a podcast this week. We'll see. We may be able to touch on some some other aspects of Utah athletics, whether that be basketball or, there's a Red Rocks preview on Friday. Maybe we could preview some of their season, but we'll try to keep, talking about a lot of these different aspects of Utah athletics, but football is going to take the priority right now, especially as the transfer portal season opens. So with that, we will call it a day. Thank you for listening once again, and I'll get back to you maybe this week. If not, we'll come back again next week and kind of do this. So thanks for everything. Hit me up if you have any questions or would like me to talk about anything or talk to somebody, and we'll see what we can do. But with that, we'll sign off today. Have a great one.